So welcome to our, what month is it? It's March.
March.
Welcome to the March New Bedford Science Cafe. My name is Carrie. I work for Mass Audubon, and I have been excited to join this team, and I'm here tonight to help out our speaker, Beckett. I want to give a big shout out to the staff who work here. Thank you so much. These folks open up especially for us on Tuesdays. They're not normally open, so it's really nice of them to be here. So please drink and eat and be merry while you're here, and be kind to your servers, as I know you always are. If you're having trouble with hearing, we're not shy. Just give us a shout out and we can adjust our voices and our mouth to the microphone, so just let us know. But I want to get right to it because I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions after Beckett's done. I'm very excited about this topic. It's near and dear to my heart. It is a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker, Beckett Colson. This fall, Beckett finished his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute joint program. He is now a postdoctoral investigator. I said you're kind of done, right? But not really. He is now a postdoctoral investigator at WHOI, working on developing a sensor for microplastics, which is what he's here to talk to us about tonight. He has been on several research cruises, most recently in Baja and mainland Mexico, where he used a carbon dioxide sensor that he built himself in an underwater vehicle to explore deep sea vents. So let's put that in your mind after we're done. If you want to come up and talk to him about that, I think that sounds like maybe we need to bring him back to talk about that too. But tonight we're specifically here to talk about microplastics and some of the work that Beckett is doing to help us learn more about that. So I'm going to turn it over to Beckett, and we're excited to learn more.
Cool. Awesome, thank you for that introduction. So I'm Beckett. I'm going to start us off today with a quick icebreaker. So I'm going to need some audience participation, just a little bit. Let's start thinking about plastics in our lives. So who here has used a single-use plastic? So something that you used once and threw it away. Me too. I had a little cup here when I ate dinner. A lot of us have cups and straws here. What about a plastic that is designed to be used every day for multiple uses? Yep, me too. I think probably an item of clothing I'm wearing right now. Lots of parts of my car that I used to drive here. And if we think about plastics in other places, they're incredibly useful. If we think about medical technologies, if we think about trying to manufacture something. As an engineer, trying to build something without using plastics is pretty much impossible. And if that tried, it'd be extremely expensive. But all the same, there's still things that probably shouldn't end up in our environment. Plastics are generally inert, but they do tend to absorb different pollutants, so called persistent organic pollutants. So they tend to absorb those things, and then when they end up in the environment, can cause harm. And so we have this big problem of, well, plastics are really useful, and we want to keep using them. But they end up in the environment and they break down into things we call microplastics, which are less than 5 millimeters in size, down to smaller than you can see. And they end up spreading all over the place. And so I want to sort of start us off thinking about the problem of sensing microplastics with my story of how I got into this field. So I participated in an SEA, Sea Education Association trip, which is just down the road in Falmouth, which was a sailing trip across the Atlantic Ocean. And my job on the ship was to count microplastics. And we had pretty primitive tools. We basically send over a net over the side of the ship, tow it for a while, pull it back up and look at what's inside, isolate everything that looks pretty clearly biological, and then take everything and put it under a microscope. Now, if you imagine looking under a microscope, that's hard enough. How do you tell these different particles apart? But imagine doing that on a rolling ship. And you can imagine the seasickness involved. So I left this trip basically realizing, one, there's plastic everywhere, even places that you wouldn't expect. Most of this time was far away from land, so talking 2 weeks of sailing, you're really far away from land and you're finding plastics pretty much everywhere. And they're really hard to tell. There's no like clear villain. There's no like labels on the plastics anymore. They're little small fragments of something that used to be useful. And so I left this thinking, wow, this is a really hard problem. How do we count these things without having bias? I was trying to be, a scientist and be as objective as possible. Is this a plastic? Is this not a plastic? But imagine someone trying to do some sort of regulation on plastics. If you're looking for them, you'll find them. If you're not, you won't. And so with this sort of manual process, we've done our best to understand microplastics in the environment, but we're kind of limited. There's a few researchers who I work with. They go out and they take filter papers. They filter 200 gallons of water and look at what they get out. And it takes them 2 to 3 days for a scientist to look at those papers and count how much plastic's in there. And this really limits our ability to tell where they're ending up, how many are out there, how they're getting to where they're going, what happens once they end up in the environment. And so we need some sort of solution. So fast forward about 5 years from that oceanographic adventure, I'm sitting in grad school in an intro to electronics class, and I sort of had that epiphany moment. Now let's be clear, there were a lot of aha moments before this that didn't turn out to be so aha. But I figured out that there might be a way to sense microplastics using electricity. And so this actually is a pretty simple concept. So you have two parallel plates, two metal plates, that you're sending electrical signal across. You're flowing water between those two plates, and if you're familiar with a capacitor, it's basically forming one of those. And as particles pass in between that electrical path, they interrupt the path. So you have sort of a resistance and a capacitance effect. So what that means is when particles go through the parallel plates, you get a little blip in the signal. Now there's a sneaky secret here, where if you measure as a function of frequency, so sending high frequency electrical waves, so much higher than the AC signal that you get from your power outlet, you can actually see through the particles. And so if you think about this, this is really useful for a field-going sensor trying to measure microplastics. Because in the environment, most of what's there is actually not plastic, it's biology. And biology, if you think about it, is made up of cells. Cells have a non-conductive outer membrane that doesn't like to pass any electricity through it, so it looks sort of solid. But inside, there's salty cytoplasm. So with this high frequency signal, just like how an X-ray you can see through your skin to your bones, you can see through the particles and see the salty cytoplasm inside. And so we actually, like when we look at the signal, you get a spike when it's a plastic and a dip when it's biology. So now we have this pretty straightforward up, down, yes, no, plastic, not plastic method. And so what I've been working on is basically taking that idea, that aha moment in the intro electronics class, and turning that into a sensor. And so far what we've done is basically take this in the lab and send everything we can through it, basically taking two circuit boards, sandwiching them together, and just running water through it with anything you can grind up to fit through. So leaves, little biological critters, every kind of plastic you can think of, and then trying to analyze the data from there. And so what you get from this is a count of how many plastics are in the water per unit time. You get how big they are, and you also get sort of how much other stuff there is. So one interesting thing is how much biology is there in comparison to plastics. You can start thinking about, okay, if I'm a filter feeder and I'm accidentally consuming a bunch of plastics, how much plastics am I eating with respect to the zooplankton that I want to eat? And so this is kind of neat. So moving forward, we sought out a patent on this, which is kind of neat. It just got granted. It's like a 2-year process. It's kind of exciting. What I'm working on now is basically taking this from this lab-based setup that I kind of hacked together with, there's a lot of epoxy involved and things like that. and taking that into the field. So I'm working on basically taking the fancy lab electronics that I was using to make the measurements, and shrinking those down, and making them cheaper, faster, better, etc. As well as thinking about how do we bring this in the field? How do we take this from just the lab and put it in the hands of scientists doing the science where they need to? And so that's sort of what I'm working on now. And in that process, we can think about what kinds of questions we can start to answer with a sensor like this. So if we imagine, say, New Bedford Harbor, and we want to understand where microplastics are coming from and where they're going. You can imagine taking a sensor, putting it on a small boat and driving around, counting plastics everywhere around, and start sort of essentially sniffing your way to where all the sources and the sinks are. There's lots of different sources of plastics. We can manufacture them intentionally. So if you remember, there used to be facial scrubs with little beads in them. Those have now been banned, but there's still other uses for small plastics. But they're also accidentally made. So one common one that people don't think of is the tire particles. So as you drive your car, you wear down the tires. And if you've done the penny test to figure out if they've gone bad or not, you know that eventually they wear down. Well, all of those little particles end up all over the road and then end up getting washed down in storm drains. And so that's one big, sort of sudden input of plastics. There are also, things that end up in the environment, so your discarded cup or the plastic bag that flew away in the wind, break down in the sun and waves into smaller pieces. And right now, we're sort of at the stage where we're just trying to understand what's happening to plastics, where are they going, and how much are there? And with those questions answered, we can then say, okay, how much do I use for something like a toxicology test? Like, what's the dose of plastic in the environment, so that I can test whether or not, sort of how bad they are. And if we're thinking about this from sort of a regulation perspective, it's really important to understand how bad plastics are in comparison to other problems. So if we want to, say, decide if we're going to put money into something like climate change versus plastics, how do we make that balance? How do we decide? Because we can't unfortunately spend money everywhere. We've run out, but understanding that trade-off is important. And so I sort of think about this sensor as part of a solution as well. So if you implement some change, let's say we add some sort of yet to be invented trap for those tire wear particles on our storm drains. Once we implement that, we need some way to show that it worked. So you can imagine using this sensor to monitor and show, our remediation effort worked. So sort of thinking about sensors also as part of the solution. I think I've probably talked for long enough, and I would love to hear all your questions. So with that, I will open it up. Yes, first question.
So, how many countries are still throwing their trash right directly into the ocean?
The question is, how many countries are currently throwing their trash directly in the ocean? So, I don't know the exact number, but I do know that there are several international treaties expressly preventing direct disposal of waste into the ocean. So any of the countries that are sort of part of those collaborations ostensibly don't do it, but there's still a lot of accidental waste disposal. So in the US, we have relatively good infrastructure. We've got garbage people who come and pick up our waste, but that's not the same in every country. And so in places that don't have good infrastructure for waste management, you tend to end up with a lot more plastics and other trash ending up in the environment sort of as a structural problem. So unfortunately, I don't have the number though. Go for it. Yeah, so the question is, what about bottom feeding fish? Can you measure how much plastic they're eating, and how do you determine the difference between their flesh and the water and what they normally eat. So actually I have a colleague at Woods Hole who works on zebrafish, and what she does actually is takes the fish and digests them. So essentially in a solution of hot hydrogen peroxide, eats away the fleshy bits, and then you're left with a bunch of different particles. And then she goes through, right now she has a very manual process where she takes those pieces that are left over and individually looks at them using some fancy lab equipment that can tell you the precise polymer that it is and what size and all that. But right now there aren't a ton of really fast solutions, but that's sort of the main method.
Is there an estimate of how much plastic there will be in the ocean 10 years from now?
Yeah, so the question is there an estimate of how much plastic there will be in the ocean in, say, 10 years? Unfortunately, I don't also have the number for that one. But if you look at a chart of how fast we're producing plastics, it's basically been exponential growth since its invention. So if you think about that as a rule of thumb, it's going up more. We're going to end up with more and more in circulation, which inevitably means more and more ending up in the ocean.
So just a technical question.
Sure.
You've got water flowing between the plates. Can that be seawater or does it have to be fresh water?
Yeah, so technical question, you've got water flowing between these plates. Can that be seawater or freshwater? So right now, I've done most of my initial tests on freshwater, just because it's way less conductive. But it can be done with saltwater as well. It's just a little bit trickier. Yeah, that's a great question. So roughly the question is about organisms that can break down plastics, and could we design ones to break them down intentionally for us? Sort of the first part of that question is yes, there are some studies that have shown that some things can break down plastics, especially once they're in the really, really small sizes, and once they've degraded in sunlight, things like that. There's also other ways that plastics can break up. One of the main ways is actually through sunlight. So plastics that are exposed to UV rays, and you might have experienced this with outdoor lawn furniture. You sit in it after 10 years and it breaks. So a similar process happens to lots of plastics that are exposed to sunlight. And so one potential solution moving forward is to work with plastics manufacturers to try and formulate plastics to break down faster, sort of intentionally breaking down, in the 10-year time scale rather than hundreds. The second part of the question about intentionally designing things, I think we have to be a little bit careful about what things we release into the environment. But there could be some applications if you have...
Consequences, right?
Yeah, some unintended consequences. But you could probably think about that in more controlled applications, say in trying to make recycling a little bit more efficient or easier to do, or waste management, say something that's more like a controlled landfill, but definitely a little bit more of a riskier plan, in my opinion.
Let's assume that the microplastics are in the seafood, for example, and we're ingesting it. Does it have any impact on the human body? Do we just excrete it, or is there, in its passage through us, do things to our bodies that we wish didn't happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, if we ingest plastics, say through seafood, what does it have any impact on the body, and if so, what? We're still trying to answer that question, unfortunately. We're pretty early on in the sort of plastics research phase, and so understanding its impact on human health as well as any other organisms is pretty much in its birth stages. However, I do take some comfort in the fact that in working in microplastics, one of the trickiest things is to stay as clean as possible when you're counting them, because the fibers from your clothes are really good at flying everywhere. And so actually, in realizing that, we're actually exposed to microfibers a lot. And we haven't rapidly dropped dead or anything like that. So if anything, it's probably a long-term thing. Also, I would say that the bodies are generally pretty good at handling, foreign objects, especially like hard, larger things. There's more of a question with the fibers because they can sort of sneak between cells and such.
Between a piece of plastic and a non-living particle like a copepod fecal pellet?
Yes, so the question is, can the sensor tell the difference between something like plastic and non-living particles like a fecal pellet? Because there's lots of those in the ocean environment. And the answer is yes. So we've tested with a bunch of different things. We haven't done fecal pellets precisely yet, but I'll add that to my list. It's a good mental list one. But generally, it does seem to be able to tell the difference, even if we take just like the shell of an organism, like a shrimp shell. We can tell the difference between that and the plastics. Good question. Yeah, so the question is, what's the unit of measure for microplastics in the water column, and what's sort of like a base reading for it? And the unit of measure, there's a couple of different ways that we can think about them. Most often, we're talking about number of particles per volume, so say like 50 particles per liter or something like that. I like to think about them also in terms of either mass or volume of plastic. So if you have, a million tiny plastics, they can add up to being like one larger plastic. And so thinking about them on that scale as well is really helpful for things like looking at like how much plastic's going into the ocean and how much we're finding there. In terms of a baseline number, I'd say that to be honest, we're still figuring that out in the environment. That's one thing that's sort of we need to do a lot more studies for. But generally, if you're taking, say, like a 1 liter sample of water from an urban area, you'll expect to find several plastics in there. If you're in the open ocean, you might not find anything in 1 liter, but you'll probably find something in, say, 200 liters.
Clear? So there, as more and more eco-friendly plastics are being developed, will in time your device be able to measure those three products?
Yeah, great question. So as more and more eco-friendly plastics get developed, will the device still be able to detect those and measure them? And I would answer it might depend a little bit on the plastic. Say if you make something that resembles really similar to biology, it might be a little bit more difficult. But for the most part, something like corn-based, like PLA, definitely looks pretty much the same, and we can see that. Yeah, so does any of the work done on PCBs, and I'm sorry I missed the second part.
Has it been helpful to you?
Oh, has it been helpful? I think yes and no. Yes, in that understanding different pollutants like PCBs helps us understand why something like microplastics might be a harmful vector. So if you think about different pollutants, plastics are really good at absorbing those, and that could be a pretty direct absorption pathway for things that accidentally or intentionally eat them. And then you could think about it as sort of like a bioaccumulation process. But in terms of sensing, that's less so. Yeah. So the first part of the question is did I say it was patented? And yes, it is patented now. And what are the challenges of bringing this out into a full-blown sensor, say that you or I could buy? I think the biggest challenge in academia is getting stuff out and into the world. So one of the things I'm working on personally is looking at the plastics problem as, is this maybe something that I might spin a startup out of? I'm still a little nervous about that life plan, but there might be other instrument manufacturers that are interested that we've been talking to who might want to pick that up. A lot of the hard part is getting past the proof of concept to something that definitely works and is viable as a commercial product. that can be really challenging to do, especially in an academic space.
And who do you see your potential customers to be? I mean,
Yeah.
governments, companies?
Yeah, so I think about this in two ways. So, sorry, excuse me. Who do you see the potential customers are for something like this? And I think about this in two ways. One from the scientist perspective and one from, sort of a company perspective. From the scientist perspective, something that you can take out in the field and measure plastics, or even something that you can just have on the bench and automate the process would be extraordinarily useful. Pretty much everyone in the field who I've talked to is like, please give me your sensor, or like, please let me be a beta tester or something, because it is so manual and so labor intensive to do it, and by hand. In terms of people who might want to buy something like this, one of the bigger potentials is if we think about like wastewater treatment plants or municipal water supplies. So California recently started regulating how much plastic it's allowing in its tap water, and in the process, it's paying people to count them by hand. But you can imagine installing this in the tap water production plant. I'm not sure what the right word is for that, or thinking about wastewater treatment plants that generally like dump the extra water out into the environment. Let's say they've implemented some change to try and have less microplastics in there. They could use that to show that they're being responsible with that. You can also think about this in like food and beverage applications. Say Coke wants to say there's no plastic in our Coke bottles. Just a little weird. Or something like baby formula. How much plastic's in your baby formula that you're giving to your child. As well as like sort of consumer applications. I'd definitely be curious to have one of these in my pocket and sort of test my drinking water wherever I go, but I might be a little paranoid perhaps. Maybe I don't want to know that actually.
So another technical question. You said that your device gives like a signal up if it's plastic and a blip if it's non-plastic. Does the height or the shape of that blip you see, does that give you an idea of the size of the particles?
Yes, so the question is about the blip that you see from the sensor. It goes up or down depending on if it's plastic or biology. Does that give you information about it? So actually it does. So we can tell the size of the plastics really well with this technique. And it's actually, something very similar is used in everyday blood counters. It's called a Coulter counter, but basically invented in the 50s as a way to count how many red blood cells and white blood cells you have in your blood. Used every day anytime you get a blood count. That basically use the change at low frequency, at DC. And we're doing it at high frequency, so it's a little bit more complicated math, but roughly speaking, we get the size. The bigger the peak, the larger the volume of the particle.
Is that time domain peak or frequency domain?
Question is in that time domain or frequency domain. So we're basically sending a constant frequency and looking at the magnitude. So if you think about a sine wave, the amplitude of that sine wave changes as it goes through. And so tracking that sine wave amplitude, kind of like you have in an AM radio, where you've got the voices superimposed on that, looking at that gives you that peak. Yeah. So all plastic isn't created equal, and how do you care about which different types? So that's definitely true. And to me, a lot of it has to do with the additives in plastics. If you remember, maybe, was it 10 years ago now, when BPA was in water bottles, and we all were throwing out our water bottles and freaking out about it for a lot of good reasons. Often the additives that are very minute amounts inside of the plastics can be far more potent than the polymer themselves. Something like a milk jug is pretty benign on average, but the risk is when it has other stuff, or once it's in the environment and it's absorbed some pollutants that have ended up in the environment anyways, sort of like the DDT leftovers essentially, then it becomes more of a problem.
are.
Oh, me. Thanks. First of all, I think you should start a GoFundMe. Please do. Send it to Science Cafe. But my question is more practical and about like the tire runoff. The tire wear really got to me. So that's like every one of us drives a car. In your wild imagination, do you see your product creating something that can capture road runoff and not just to notify, like what's the road runoff here?
Yeah, so the question is about the tire particles and realizing how that's an impact that we all have, and can the device in the future maybe collect those particles. So sort of I keep having two-part answers, but the first part is sort of thinking about this as like a sensor as a solution. So monitoring that input and thinking about maybe ways that we could collect those particles, but we can also think about this as something that's more like a tunable filter, if you will, where this signal that I described is basically instantaneous. So you can imagine something that you've got to get the electronics in the background happening properly first, that basically switches the flow of water one way or another, depending on if it's detected a piece of plastic or not. This is something that you'd have to scale up pretty significantly for something like road runoff, but could work in smaller scales as is. Scaling up, basically, we have to hope that the cheaper electronics method that I'm working on works out well. So the question is, if we're in New Bedford Harbor and we've got the sensor on board, how are we going to spot the places where microplastics are going in? So great question. There's sort of two ways that we can think about doing sort of this like science plan here. One is sort of, let's assume we know nothing and basically do a lawnmower path all around New Bedford Harbor, maybe getting away a lot of boats on the process. Or we can do something a little bit more targeted. Say we have hypotheses about where the plastics might be coming from. So like for example, the outflow from a river or from a storm drain. Then we go near those places, measure, and then we go somewhere else where we think there aren't any plastics, measure there, and then go somewhere else that we sort of don't have any idea, measure there. Probably do some sort of hybrid of both of those. But the real answer is right now, with the manual method, all you can do is go out and pick like 3 places. And that's going to be all of your data is from those 3 places. With this, you can get much more of a full picture. So the question is, there data now about how much plastics are in fish? And since we're apex predators, are they accumulating in us because of that? And unfortunately, I don't know a ton about this area, but I do know that generally it's been shown that bigger things like, say, like a tuna that's eaten some plastic, they're pretty good at flushing those back out again. Pretty much their digestive system figures out that that's not food and sends it back out. Where we get more concerns are with smaller things or with fibers. So some people have done some targeted studies with, say, clams, where they intentionally feed them plastics. And generally, over the course of the routine digestive cycle, they send them back out into the environment, except for the fibers. The fibers seem to get a little bit stuck. And so that's where maybe there might be some sort of bioaccumulation process. But that's also still kind of early in the science process as well.
Can your device determine, like, distinguish between a fiber, for example, in that situation? Can it actually discern it? And I guess my follow-on, that was like an extra question. My first question was actually just about monitoring and the value of monitoring. That's really what you're creating an enormously valuable tool for monitoring that we currently lack, right? And the next step is, what does that tell us about prescriptions for management? And then how do we evaluate the pros and cons of those managements once we've implemented? And then how do we educate, right? So we've got this sort of series And I feel like your device is going to help every step of the way. And so if you can if you saw the best course to end up with a really educated application of change, do you have that in mind already?
Yeah. So the first part of the question is, can you tell fibers apart from other types of plastics? And right now I'm not sure about the answer to that question. The sensor basically works off of the volume of the particle. And so fibers, you can think about, they're like super, super skinny and long. So they have, the same volume as a particle that's really tiny, but they can be easier to miss. Working on that though. I'm working on adding sort of a light-based method to try and get shape as well. For the second part of your question is thinking about this monitoring as part of this whole ecosystem, if you will, of thinking about plastics and how we manage them. I think that my current ideal vision of this is in a wastewater treatment plant application where you have something that's generally people say that a lot of the fibers end up coming back out of the wastewater treatment process. Let's say someone invents a new filter method, or you implement a longer settling time in the settling tanks or something like that. Some change that probably makes the plant a little bit harder to run, but you get less plastics. You'll be able to show that the effluent coming out of the plant actually did change. Or if it didn't change, then they can go back to the status quo and go back to the drawing board, figure out something better. And so using it as a tool to say, yeah, our solution works, I think is really valuable, because a lot of times we implement solutions that aren't perfect. We can always improve. Yeah. So the question is right now it sounds like the sensor is basically land-based, and are there plans for having something that can go out in the ocean or out in a waterway and continuously monitor? That's basically the dream. So right now we have this lab-based system, and my mission is basically by this summer have something that we take out that's like a human portable kind of thing that we can take out in small boats. After that step, thinking about, okay, can we install this on a mooring or install this on an underwater vehicle? And then thinking even longer term, could we put this on a glider that's going and doing full ocean transects, and getting more data that way. So baby steps along the way. Yeah, so just for the question, if I got it, is basically this is like a David and Goliath problem that we're fighting of. There's a lot of systemic processes that make plastics cheap and plentiful in our society, just like there are a lot of different processes making fossil fuels easy to use and continue to use. And yes, you're totally right. It is a very complex problem with many, many stakeholders. And there's not going to be one solution that's sort of like a silver bullet. And it's also going to be something that we need to think about carefully. So I'm certainly not advocating for getting rid of plastics overall. I think they're incredibly useful, and there are some applications that they're basically indispensable. So one example of that is keeping medical supplies sterile before they're used in an operating room. That's something that's really, really important, really hard to change, and maybe can stay that way. But there are some changes that we can do. So, for example, one thing that really bothers me is when the grocery store cuts up fruit and then packages it up all nicely, and it's like, it was a cantaloupe that had its own packaging. And now you've made it have a package. To be honest, convenient food is good sometimes, but there are ways that we can think about more responsibly using things, or choosing things that we know are easier to recycle. Sort of thinking about some personal choices, but also participating in the political process and electing officials that care about different things. Yeah, so the question is there a depth in the ocean that microplastics are more of a problem? And that's actually another question that we haven't quite figured out yet. So the majority of microplastics research has happened using Newston which basically just capture the very upper layer of the ocean. So you only get the floaters. But if you do the math of how much plastic we think is ending up in the environment and how much we find, there's a giant amount missing. And so one of the theories is that some of them are breaking down, but that can't account for all of this. So a lot of them are probably sinking down. There's many plastics that are actually denser than seawater that will just sink automatically. But things also like to grow in them, and which make them sink down too. So there could be things like, they call them like a density layer, so where you have, say, hot water meeting cold water, or salty water meeting less salty water. Those are areas that can accumulate particles like plastics and other things that could be really like large hotspots that we're basically just missing with our current methods. But certainly modeling suggests that they should be there.
Thank you so much, Beckett. You are a mad scientist in all the best ways. I love that your brain exists in this world, and what you're doing is so important, so thank you so much. And thank you for all those amazing questions. I think we learned a lot. I hear about microplastics a lot, but I'm learning that I probably didn't know nearly as much as I should know. So thank you for educating us and for being an inventor. We need that.
Good questions.
And I hope you'll stick around for a few minutes while everyone enjoys the rest of their drinks and food. We can talk about microplastics or deep sea vents or
Sure.
inventing something new that we need to invent. And I hope you'll all join us next month. We'll be back here on Tuesday, April 4th with Tim Herbert, a marine biologist and oceanographer at Brown University. He will tell us about his recent trip off the coast of Portugal, where he and his team drilled into the ocean floor to recover 15 million years of ocean history. So I think that'll tie in nicely with this. We'll learn about what sunk down there and got stuck in the ocean, and hopefully it's not plastics, right? So thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.